Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the New York Sun. It's a great pleasure to have you all with us. For those of you who are not yet familiar, the New York Sun is one of America's most historic and iconic news publications, founded back in 1833. That's 18 years before the New York Times. We're famous for introducing newsboys, paper boys, personal ads, front page headlines, first crime reporter, the first woman in American journalism in 1875. The Associated Press was founded in our office, and we published in 1897 one of the most famous editorials published of all time, Yes, Virginia, There is a Santa Claus. We are also known for having published the shortest ever editorial in the history of newspapers. It was an endorsement of Theodore Roosevelt, and it went like this: Theodore, comma, with all thy faults, exclamation mark. With that, and without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce our guest for this evening, Robert F. Kennedy, Jr. Thank you for joining us. That's for you. To an engaging and substantive conversation with you tonight, and in particular exploring and unpacking the immense impact that you have had on the political stage in this country in an accelerated and enhanced format over the last number of months. Just to start with, you know, you have a lot of nicknames. What should I call you? How do you like to be referred to?
You can call me Robert.
Okay. More formal. Preferred. You entered the campaign.
You can call me anything you want. I've been called a lot of bad stuff, and I have very thick skin, so
Okay.
I really don't care what people call me. So whatever you're comfortable with.
Got it. So let's start with this. You enter the campaign with a bang, running for president, going for the big prize. More recently, you've thrown your support behind another candidate. Is this how you wanted it to go? Is this how you expected it might go? Did you sort of hope it might go all the way, but this is a good second? Or how do you feel about how you've landed sort of politically in this moment?
Well, you know, my attitude, I got in to win. And I thought that there was a chance that I could win, particularly if I could get a fair hearing from the voters in the Democratic Party, and if President Biden, I was very confident that if President Biden debated me, that I had a very, very good chance of winning. And, or if I could get on TV, on the network TV, ABC, NBC, CBS, and CNN, and I've been censored on those networks since 2014. So, and the New York Times, the Washington Post, and I was kind of a darling on all of those networks prior to that. In fact, I was one of two people, myself and Henry Kissinger, who had deals with the New York Times where we would publish an op-ed every 6 months. And usually they won't take an op-ed from the same writer in the same year, but they had come to both of us and said, we want an op-ed. So I had a very, very secure position and the affection of the networks and most of the liberal media. When I started talking about issues, and particularly vaccination, they started systematically shutting me down. But I thought, and one of the reasons that I initially was thinking, you know, if I run for president, I'm censored on all these networks. But if I'm run for president, there are rules that make it illegal technically. As it turns out, they're not enforceable. But technically, for them to censor you, they have to give equal time. So I thought, number one, I could actually win. And and number two, that even if I didn't win, at least I'd get to talk to the American people about these very critical issues. And, but initially my polling was very good. I was winning at the outset. After a couple of months of campaigning, I was scoring between 20 and 27% in the polls. So I actually had a very good chance. And then the Democratic Party started shutting down the primaries so that they actually were canceling primaries. They adopted a rule that I had already been campaigning in New Hampshire. They adopted 60 separate rules to prevent me from winning no matter how many votes I got. So they passed, for example, one rule that said that any candidate who stepped a foot into the state of New Hampshire, and I had already done that, could not win any delegates from New Hampshire. So all my delegates would go to the president. And then they just shut down some of the primaries. And it was clear that I couldn't win. But more importantly, the media really fell in line with the Democratic Party in ways that had never happened before ever in history. So I was censored almost completely, blanket censorship on all those networks. When Ross Perot ran in 1992, he was running for 10 months, and he had 34 live interviews. I was running for 18 months, and I only had 2 live interviews on those networks. So I was effectively shut out, and the stuff that people were hearing on those networks were mainly defamations, they were fabrications, they were mischaracterizations of my actions and opinions. I ended up getting on the new media, on these long-form podcasts like Joe Rogan and Jordan Peterson and all of this new world of media. And
Trump's had a lot of success with that also, it seems.
Yeah, and for me, it was really, it's really interesting because my uncle arrived at a time when television, his campaign was the first campaign that was covered by television, where there was a TV debate. And he was very good on television, and that allowed him to win by the narrowest margin in American history, but, that debate particularly. Trump arrived at a time, FDR had arrived at a time when radio was emerging, and he took advantage of that media to win. Trump took advantage of social media, of Twitter, which really allowed him to win. And I found a real niche on these long-form interviews. And if you look at the people who were supporting me, I was beating President Trump and President Biden consistently among Americans under 35 years of age, consistently by 10 points. And I was beating them among independents, because those are the people who listen to long-form interviews. The people that I could not put a dent in was baby boomers, which should be the demographic that actually supported me, because these are people who remember Camelot and the Kennedy administration, and they were, they had a lot of affection for me when I was the environmental champion alone. But I could not reach them. So, and if you were living in that information ecosystem of ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, you would have had, if that's the only ecosystem that I was living in, I would have a very low opinion of myself. I wouldn't vote for myself.
Right. But, those platforms, have less influence today. I mean, would you say that was a bigger factor, or really Kamala's entry into the race?
They do have a tremendous influence among the biggest voting cohort, which is baby boomers.
Right.
Baby boomers do look at Facebook, and I know there are exceptions to this room. Generally speaking, and you're in this room because you're an exception. Oh, the baby boomers who do not use social media at all are really look at me in kind of like a demon form. And and that is the biggest cohort, and particularly in a Democratic primary, that is absolutely the critical cohort. Right. So, it was impossible for me to get through with them, and then I was fenced out of the party. Right. And I was the last one in my campaign, in the inner circle of my campaign, to agree that I had to leave the party and go independent. Right. So then I did that.
Is it fair to say that the entry of switch to Kamala Harris was kind of the final straw?
Again, the final straw was that they figured out ways to keep me off the debating stage.
Right.
Because I think if I had gotten on the debating stage with President Trump and Vice President Harris, that there's a good chance that I could have changed things.
So,
thank you.
So now you've thrown your support behind President Trump.
Yeah.
There's talk that, one outcome of that, should he be successful in the election, is that you would hold a role in a potential Trump administration. Here's what the New York Times had to say about that today. I'd love to hear your response. They have an article titled, "What to Expect if RFK is Promoted to a Position of Power." That article includes the following paragraph. He has no meaningful claim to health expertise beyond an impressive... What they say is he has no meaningful claim to health expertise beyond an impressive geriatric six-pack.
That's nice. I'll take it.
But what do you expect that a role might look like? What would be a best-case scenario for you? And what would you say we should expect if RFK Jr. is promoted to a position of power?
Well, first of all, I would point out that I've written 4 books on public health, including the best-selling book of 2020. And I've been litigating on public health and environmental issues and on scientific issues for 40 years. I've litigated against almost all the health agencies, NIH, CDC, FDA, HHS, the USDA, as well as I just won a case in the Court of Appeals against FCC for lying to the public about cell phone radiation. But, the important, I would say, here's how I would answer that question by the New York Times. I'd say, what we don't really need at HHS is more medical expertise. What we need is an expertise on decoupling the agency from institutional corruption. And because it's the corruption that has distorted the science, and the science that has distorted the recommendations, and the recommendations that have distorted the health impacts that have ended up, with America having the sickest population in the history of the world. So what I know how to do is to go in and get rid of the conflicts of interest and then let the science take care of itself. I'm not trying to impose my ideologies or my worldviews on the American public. What I want to give the American public is their freedom of choice. Americans are, and most people are smart. They're going to make good decisions, and we need to trust them. The thing that distorts public health is that Americans are willing to take advice from the federal health agencies. When the Surgeon General told us to stop smoking, we had a huge drop in smoking. When the HHS told us to take the COVID vaccine, most Americans did. And various recommendations throughout history, the American public have taken them. So the problem is we're giving them bad recommendations. And what I will do is, first of all, end the tyranny of Medicare. For example, if you're diagnosed with diabetes, Medicare will only allow your doctor to give you Ozempic or Metformin. And if you're diagnosed with SSRI, with depression, you get SSRIs. If you're diagnosed with cholesterol, you get statins, and they won't pay for anything else. In Europe, the standard of care for diabetes is not a drug. It's exercise and good food. And Medicaid ought to if our desire is to have good outcomes for public health, Medicaid ought to let the patients and their doctors figure out an individualized plan for that patient based upon the best science possible. So our job should not be to dictate outcomes or clinical guidelines in terms of, you can only take this drug, it's the only intervention that it's allowed. We should be giving the best science to scientists all over this country, and then telling Medicaid whatever that, to doctors all over this country, whatever that doctor recommends, then Medicaid is going to pay for it. So if Medicaid says, if a doctor's patient has diabetes or obesity, the doctor ought to be able to say, I'm going to recommend gym membership, and I'm going to recommend good food. And Medicaid ought to be able to finance those things the same as they would Ozempic.
So,
Let me say one other thing. Right now, Medicaid, Congress has a bill before it that is going to pass because it is bipartisan, unusually. Why is it bipartisan? It's bipartisan because the Republicans and Democrats of Congress have all been bought off by the biggest company in Europe, which is called Novo Nordisk, which makes Ozempic. Ozempic is not going to be sold widely in Europe. It's the biggest company in Europe because it's expecting hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars from Americans. In Denmark, where Novo Nordisk is headquartered, the Danish government does not recommend it for obesity. It recommends exercise and good food. Oh, in this country, we're going to mandate it for anybody who's overweight. Well, Medicaid will have to recommend them. There's 74% of our population is now overweight. If every one of them got Ozempic, it would cost us, it's $1,500 a month, it would cost us $3 trillion a year. And that's what Novo Nordisk is based its financial projections on. If we spent 1/3 of that buying organic food for every American 3 meals a day, we could do.
right. So
We could end the diabetes epidemic in this country, but that's not what they want. They want us to be dependent on pharmaceutical interventions that have, that are very expensive and not very effective.
So I mean, it sounds like the position. It sounds like the position in an administration through which you could be most effective on these issues that you speak out so passionately about. Is that sort of health secretary? Is that kind of what you have your eye on? That would be ideal for you.
I haven't spoken directly with President Trump about where I would serve. He's asked me to help. What he's asked me to do at this moment is to serve on his transition team. And there's 20 of us on that team. I asked him if he would also appoint Tulsi Gabbard, which he did. And so, when the president comes into office, he has to appoint 14,000 people to posts. So the transition team chooses who those people are. And they also outline the policies that they're supposed to implement.
And is his team siloed into sort of segments? Namely, is there a health policy segment and a foreign policy segment, or is it sort of just broader and they figure it out as they go?
There is a slight silo, but it's not exclusive silos. And he's given me essentially a portfolio that is across the board portfolio to all the agencies. So I'll be looking at the military and the intelligence apparatus and, a lot of other agencies.
So I want to take the conversation in a practical direction for a second, because some of the key issues that you advocate for, you focus on a policy level, which is understandable. Obviously, you're running for a government office to have a role in government to be able to implement policy changes. But for people who are interested in these ideas and trying to implement them in their daily lives, it seems like there are a lot of significant practical impediments. For example, some of what you've been talking about vis-a-vis pesticides in food and goods, and how that ends up on the table and people eat it, and that causes, health risks or complications. Obviously, the same with the vaccine, and let's call it vaccine choice, where parents could choose which vaccines they want to take and how many vaccines they want to take. The way that things are sort of set up today, you go to a supermarket, even if it says natural ingredients, you don't know what the crop was sprayed with. For example, you send your kids to a school, they demand that all the vaccine forms are filled out and up to date before you could show up on day one with your kid to school. So short of growing all of your own food and homeschooling all of your own kids, how do Americans who are listening to what you're saying and want to make a difference in their own lives, short of all of these great policy changes which may or may not come to be, how are they able to live healthier and navigate, let's say, vaccine choice?
Well, I mean, those are, let me outline why, the premise for your question, which is it's very difficult for people to have that choice right now. And it's just the system is designed to ensconce industry, the mercantile ambitions of these industries ahead of public health. So it's designed to get you to leave you no choice but to eat bad food. And it does this mainly through a system of subsidies that makes that food the cheapest and most highly subsidized and the most available, particularly in poor neighborhoods.
And with high fructose corn syrup, which you speak about,
right,
I mean, that's all commercial,
and to deprive the public of the appropriate knowledge. So we're not allowed to label GMOs, for example, and tell the public you're eating GMOs. You may not like to eat GMOs for a variety of reasons, that the GMOs themselves may have problems because they're untested and there's strong indications that they alone can cause health impacts. But almost all GMOs, and particularly corn, which is corn and soy, which are the big, and wheat, those crops are saturated with pesticides, and the GMO is usually Roundup Ready. It's the genetic alteration that has been instilled in that crop, in the corn, is resistant to the pesticide Roundup, so that planes can fly over the cornfields and saturate the entire environment with Roundup, and the only green thing that will ever grow there is GMO corn, is what they call Roundup Ready corn. So the whole premise of that crop is that it's going to increase pesticides in our food. And so, and here is how the subsidies work. And you're not allowed to know about a lot of these things because you're not, the labeling of GMOs has essentially been illegalized. But there are subsidies. There are hundreds of billions of dollars given in crop subsidies. The crop subsidies are mainly for those three crops, and those three crops, soy, wheat, and corn, are the feedstock for the processed food industry. So they make those very, very cheap, almost free, and therefore they can give you the illusion of cheap food. So there's a subsidy there, and then the food stamps, 70% of the food stamp program is for processed foods. 10% of food stamps go to sugar drinks. And this is giving us the diabetes epidemic and the obesity epidemic. And then school lunch programs, also about 70% of those are for processed foods. So kids are raised on those foods. And just to give you a little idea of the etiology of processed foods, in the 1980s and 1990s, the tobacco companies were some of the richest companies on earth. They had the giant cash reserves. They were under attack by the government that was suing them, the various state governments and the bar, which are bringing these class action suits and reimbursements of Medicaid suits. And then also there was advertising where the government was telling people you shouldn't smoke, and the Surgeon General made that recommendation, and smoking levels were declining precipitously. In order to diversify their businesses, the tobacco companies began moving into the food industry. I think mid-1990s, the two biggest food companies on earth were Philip Morris and R.J. Reynolds. the two biggest tobacco companies. They bought Kraft and all these other food companies, and then they moved thousands of scientists from the tobacco industry who had been preoccupied for many years in trying to make tobacco more addictive and more attractive. And they moved them into foods. They began devising chemicals that would make food addictive, processed food addictive, like MSG and many, many other chemicals. They made these chemicals in laboratories, and to also make sure that the food did not satiate appetite, so you could eat as much as you wanted and you'd still want more. Your body would be telling you and your brain would be telling you you need more. And this is when the obesity epidemic began. And at the same time, they were able to paralyze the federal government to derail any regulations. We have 1,000 ingredients in our food that are illegal in Europe. If you look at, for example, Fruit Loops, which was the top of the food pyramid, that's the other thing is they also bought the panels that make recommendations for food and clinical guidelines for medicine. So they're all conflict of interest with the food industry and the farm industry. And Fruit Loops in this country contain red dye, yellow dye, blue dye, all these dyes, all of them grow tumors. All of them cause neurological impacts, particularly ADHD, which are very, very well documented. And those dyes are illegal in Europe and Canada. Kellogg's sells Fruit Loops in Canada and Europe. But the Fruit Loops in those countries don't contain any of those chemicals. They contain vegetable dyes, which are much safer. So the same company that is poisoning us and knows they're poisoning us is making the same product across the border that is not so poisoned, and in Europe. And so, and they have captured the agencies, they've captured Congress, they've captured the press, because they're the biggest advertisers, pharma and food, and they're brainwashing us. And then, of course, they start when kids are little with the food stamp program and with this advertising, Tony the Tiger, et cetera, the same way the tobacco industry did. And they're addicting kids to sugar. FDA now recommends that 2-year-olds get processed sugar every day. This is criminal.
So I want to just take this back to my practical question, and I understand all the points that you're making. I mean, it sounds like what you're saying is choice one is, get all these changes made sort of on a government level, which may or may not happen. Choice two is, grow all your own food and homeschool your kids. Choice three is maybe order all your food from Europe. I mean, that's not...
Well, actually, you can get Fruit Loops, Canadian Fruit Loops, on Amazon that are the same price, as you get them in the grocery store.
So we order all our food from Canada.
So what we need to do is change the panel so they're making good recommendations and they're telling people don't eat these foods. Now, is that going to solve the problem? No, because the processed foods are the cheapest, and particularly in poor neighborhoods, they're the only, I work a lot in Bedford-Stuyvesant Restoration in New York, in Brooklyn, one of the poorest neighborhoods in the country. And the nearest grocery store when I started working there was 75 blocks and 3 different buses. And so very, very difficult for a mother who wants to take care of her children and make good choices. She really can't do it. She doesn't have access. If you're asking me, I'm not a doctor and I don't make health recommendations for people, but I can tell you what I do, and I've done for many years. Somebody gave me this advice many years ago, and I took it, and it was quite easy for me, which is never eat anything in a package. So I don't eat anything in a package, and I do other stuff as well. But
do you grow a lot of your own food?
No, I do grow some of it, but I don't grow much. And most people, it's kind of irrelevant what I do because most people don't have access to the resources I have.
Right.
And if you live in Bed-Stuy, you just don't have the ability to grow your own food. So we need to change, number one, the government recommendations. We need to start forcing these companies to internalize their costs so the illusion of cheap food goes away. Right. Because if you're drinking Coke and it seems cheap and it gives you diabetes, over the long run, that's not very cheap, right?
Yeah.
And you get on Ozempic, which is costing us $1,500 a month. Well, that's not cheap food. It's the illusion of cheap food, and it's seductive.
Right.
But it's a perverse incentive that's incentivizing Americans to injure themselves. And of course, food and pharma want that because for them, the most profitable asset in our country is a sick child. Right. They don't want to kill our children. They want them sick for life and dependent on pharmaceutical interventions.
It sounds like, without these real policy changes, you feel that Americans are kind of trapped.
I think it's an existential crisis.
Existential.
When my uncle was president, America will not be destroyed because we don't, have a good enough social safety net or because we made bad budgetary choices. America will be destroyed because we're poisoned. And right now, we're the sickest country in the world. When my uncle was president, 6% of Americans had chronic disease. Today, it's close to 60%. When my uncle was president, 3.4% of Americans were obese. Today, it's 74% are obese or overweight. Compare that to Japan, which is 3%. Oh, they're not being poisoned. We are. Americans didn't. Go look at a photograph from 1968, 69, and you won't see any obese people in the crowd. Today, it's very, very different. Go look at Woodstock photos or whatever you want from back then. There's no obesity. Obesity, in 1900, if you were obese, you went to a circus, and case reports were written about you. Truthfully, it was so unusual back then. It was like a landmark if somebody was obese. Today, it's been normalized, but it's not normal, and it's not people's fault. It's not a moral failing. It's not willpower failing. We are being mass poisoned.
Right. I want to sort of switch directions for a second. Obviously the Middle East has been in the headlines lately. Is it fair to sort of describe your foreign policy as non-interventionist?
My foreign policy is that we should do everything we can to end our addiction to foreign wars. Ukraine is a war of choice. I don't believe that about Israel's war. I think Israel was attacked. I think our country has had only one moral war in the last 100 years, and that's World War II. Because we were attacked. We were attacked by an adversary that was committed to our destruction. And I don't think we had any choice but to go to war. But all the other wars that we fought were wars of choice, and they were wars that were driven by the economic imperatives of the military-industrial complex, which Eisenhower warned us about 3 days before my uncle took the oath of office. My uncle kept us out of foreign wars. He refused to send a single combat troop abroad anywhere, although he was under tremendous pressure to send troops to Laos, to Vietnam. He sent advisors. He never sent a combat troop. And 30 days before he died, he learned that 75 Americans had died from Vietnam, and he signed National Security Order 263, ordering all Americans home. He told his best friend, Ben Bradley, that the primary job of the President of the United States was to keep the country out of war. He said that he didn't want children in Africa and Asia and Latin America, when they heard about the United States of America, to think of a man with a gun. He wanted them to think of a Peace Corps volunteer, of the Kennedy Milk Program, which gave nutrition to tens of millions of hungry children around the world, Alliance for Progress, USAID, which were intended to lift the poor and build middle classes in those countries, build markets, build democracies, and help them do that. To exercise leadership, not bullying, not at the barrel of a gun. As a result of that, there are now more statues to my uncle in Africa, Latin America, more boulevards named after him, more avenues, more universities, hospitals, and any other U.S. president, probably more than any other president combined. That's a good foreign policy.
Right.
And that's the foreign policy that Donald Trump wants, which is a policy of not of isolationism, of projecting economic power abroad rather than military power, which is just making Americans poorer, less safe, less secure, and with less friends, and economically destroyed.
Right.
And our moral authority gone. Israel is a completely different case.
I want to talk about that a little bit, because you have been incredibly supportive of Israel. In fact, you told the New York Sun in an interview a little while ago that, this is when you were still in the race, that you feel that it's so important to be on the right side of the issue of Israel that you'd rather lose the race than be on the wrong side of it, which is a pretty strong statement to make. Now, today, obviously, I guess at the end of a pretty difficult year for the Israelis, it does seem like the tide is turning, and certainly they're on a roll in Lebanon and in dealing with Hezbollah. Yet you hear from this administration, ceasefire, ceasefire, ceasefire. What would your message be to the Israelis at this time?
I think we should encourage peace, and I think that we should do everything we can to make sure that the Palestinians have, the Palestinian people.
I'm talking about the campaign against Hezbollah in Lebanon.
Yeah, well, what is your question about Hezbollah? Should we be requiring?
Well, the administration now, the White House is saying, you've taken out Nasrallah, now stop. Let's have a ceasefire in Lebanon. What would your message be to the Israelis at this time?
I think we need to allow the Israelis to make that decision on their own. I would be doing everything I could to try to bridge the sides, and also I think what's happened this week is very encouraging with the statements the Saudis have made, and also I think the successes that Israel had, the military successes, this extraordinary military successes that Israel's had, really unprecedented history and very, very targeted, which is what everybody wanted. Let's target the leadership. And they did that again and again instead of, doing mass bombing, et cetera, which in Gaza, I think was much more difficult. But I think it actually has had the impact of de-escalating the chances of a full-out war in the region with Iran, which is the thing that I was most terrified of.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, the wisdom in the Middle East certainly is that strength brings about de-escalation. It seems that the view from
I think that's right.
It seems that the view from the White House is the opposite. Take a step back.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right, and I think the response of the Saudis this week, and it was clear the Saudis were building bridges to Iran because they perceived Israel as weak after October 7th, and so they were reaching out to Iran, and I think that was, that was not a good outcome, and I think now the Saudis are very confident that Israel is going to be their partner in the future, and that Israel can contain Iranian ambitions for regional hegemony, which the Saudis don't want, and the Qataris don't want, and the Emiratis don't want, and the Egyptians don't want. Nobody really wants that, but they were making noises like it was okay for them as long as they believed that Israel was weak.
Would you like to have a role in an administration that related to foreign policy and Middle East related issues, or is your view you can't take on everything and you're really focused on making America healthy and you want to kind of stay in your lane, as it were?
I mean, foreign policy has always been, one of my primary preoccupations, and I think, I would love to maintain some kind of influence on foreign policy. I think the importance of ending the war in Ukraine and this terrible, terrible risk we're now bearing of nuclear war, which we've never been closer to nuclear war. What's happened in the last couple of weeks is extraordinary, and we've seen a coup d'etat, really, or not a coup d'etat, but a mutiny by the Pentagon and by the Defense Department, because the State Department, Tony Blinken, and the neocons actually, encouraged the invasion of Russia, which was reckless and foolhardy and disastrous military choice. But now they've been encouraging the use of the British Storm Shadow missiles, shooting long-range missiles to the Kremlin directly into Russia, and they're controlled by U.S. satellites. And Putin said, if you do that, we're going to consider ourselves to be at war with the United States of America. Then he took this extraordinary step this week or last week, which was, for many years, the United States of America was the only country that had a nuclear country that refused to sign a commitment against the first use of nuclear weapons. All the other countries signed it, including Russia. But last week, Russia reversed that and said, we will now, if we feel ourselves under existential threat from a conventional attack on our country, we will use nuclear weapons first. So it's crazy what we're doing. We walked away from unilaterally, the United States walked away from two nuclear missile treaties with Russia that prohibited the placement of long-range missiles. And, the Russians worry that if we put NATO in Ukraine, we will then follow by putting the Aegis missile systems there, the Tomahawk missiles, which are nuclear-tipped, 3.5 minutes from the Kremlin. And we could decapitate the entire Kremlin leadership without warning in 3.5 minutes, and that destabilized the entire world. My uncle knew that. We would never tolerate in this hemisphere, and we didn't. My uncle was going to go to war with Cuba if they didn't take him out. He always said that if you want peace in the world, you have to be able to put yourself in the shoes of your adversary and talk to your adversary. And we're not doing that today. My uncle reached out to Khrushchev repeatedly. They formed a friendship. They both realized they were surrounded by military brass and intelligence apparatus that considered nuclear war not only inevitable, but also desirable, and wanted it. And that only Khrushchev and my uncle stood against it. They began corresponding with each other directly through a spy who used to visit my house when I was a kid, a guy called Georgy Bolshoi. He used to do the Cossack dancing, and we loved him as kids, and it was cool having a KGB and GRU spy in our house. Khrushchev trusted him and began drafting himself in his own hand these long, very personal letters to my uncle about the need to avoid war, and he gave them to Bolshoi. Bolshoi hid them in the New York Times and smuggled them to my uncle. And then my uncle put in a hotline because he didn't trust his own CIA. He didn't trust his own military brass. He wanted to be able to talk to Khrushchev every hour of the day, constantly, directly, just him and Khrushchev. And this administration, in contrast, has refused not only to talk to Putin, but Putin is making statements every day. You can't do this. Here's what we're going to do. And nobody's listening to him. And it's quite extraordinary that nobody is listening to him. And it's a very, very dangerous situation for the world.
On the other nuclear question, I mean, obviously concerns about Iran going nuclear is a big one. Is there an approach that you favor, namely I guess let's call it the policy of appeasement that this administration and the Obama administration had? Or is your view there's no deal to be done, we take Trump's approach, pull out of the deal and pursue a maximum pressure campaign on the Iranians?
I think we should be putting pressure on the Iranians and maximum pressure on the Iranians. Because I think not only is this critical because it's existential to Israel, but also nobody in the Mideast wants Iran is going to feel safe if Iran has nuclear weapons. I think the Gulf states are even more worried about it than Israel, but they're less willing to talk about it, but they're terrified about it.
Now, this is obviously quite personal for you, but your father, it's well known, was killed by was murdered by a Palestinian terrorist. how would you say that that fact shaped your views of the conflict, of the region?
Yeah, I mean, Sirhan was, you know, I don't know if you know this, but I don't believe that Sirhan killed my father. Sirhan either willingly or unwillingly was involved in the ambush, and he fired shots at my father. He fired 2 shots at my father, and both of them, one of them hit a door jamb behind my father. The other hit my father's friend, Paul Schrade, in the head, who was one of my closest friends throughout life, and he died a year and a half ago. But then Sirhan's gun was pushed in the other direction by 6 men, all of whom I knew, you know, including Rayford Johnson and Rosie Greer. And he then fired 6. Rayford Johnson, who was a decathlon champion, gold medal in 1960, became really close friends with my father. He's essentially a father to my little brother Max. And he told me he was the one who grabbed Sirhan's hand and pushed it away from my father. They bent him over a steam table and pushed his gun in the other direction from my father. And Sirhan fired 6 more shots, and all those shots hit people. So we know what happened to every shot in Sirhan's gun. My father was killed with 4 shots from behind, and Sirhan was never behind him. And they were fired almost certainly by a man called Eugene Thane Caesar, who was a intelligence agency, U.S. intelligence agency operative. But I grew up believing that Sirhan killed my father. I actually went and met with him after I started reading the autopsy reports. But it did not make me feel like I had a mission to punish Palestinian people. I never blamed the Palestinian people. My family has had a very, very close relationship with the Arab world since 1956. My Uncle John Kennedy made a famous speech about in that year that alienated him in his own party and alienated him against the foreign policy apparatus, saying that Arabs should be able to run their own countries. He was specifically talking about Algeria at that time. But I and my family have had a long, good relationship with Arabs all over the world. I believe that they should have self-sovereignty, self-rule, and dignity, and make their own choices. But Israel, my family also had a very, very strong love for Israel and support for Israel. Israel's the only democracy in the Mideast. It's the only country in the Mideast that has freedom of speech, freedom of worship. There's 26 nations in the Mideast that have official religions, and Israel is the only one that has freedom of religion. And it has freedom of press. It has everybody can vote. There's 2.2 million Palestinians in Israel that have all the rights of Jews in Israel. And so this idea that Israel is somehow an apartheid state is just propaganda. And, you know, Israel's our closest ally in the region. It's a very important ally, moral authority in the region. And it's important to us from strategic and military interests as well.
Yeah. Now, I mean, obviously, considering your views of your father's death.
Yeah, I do want to say this one other thing. I'm sorry. When Sirhan pled guilty to killing my dad. Sirhan says he has no memory of it, and I believe he has no memory of it. And he's consistently said that for now 55 years. But when he was initially convicted after pleading guilty to killing my father, Judge Walker was going to give him the death penalty and was very clear about that. And my uncle, myself, all the members of my family signed a letter to him pleading with him not to give the death penalty because it's not something that my father would have supported. And so I don't, you know, and I've fought now for 10 years to try to get Sirhan released from prison. So I don't, and by the way, Sirhan was a Christian He was a Palestinian, but he was a Christian. And I don't hate Palestinians. I want the best for them, and I have great compassion that the people have died. But I don't blame Israel or what's happened in Gaza.
Right.
I blame Hamas.
Right.
And that is, they're the culprit.
Yeah. Now, obviously, considering your view of what happened to your father and also what happened to your uncle, considering that you have been as outspoken and more on very controversial issues, I mean, does it ever cross your mind that you might be a target in a similar way? I mean, obviously, seeing what's happened to President Trump over the last, months, I mean, do you ever feel that your body life is at risk in doing what you do?
I do feel that way, but it's not something that I ever worry about. So I feel my life is in God's hands, that I have a job to do what I'm supposed to do. And I just don't live in fear of anything. I try to make sure that that any kind of fear is just not part of my life. And it doesn't mean I'm stupid about it or reckless. There's a guy hiding behind each of these little curtains here, in case one of you want to take a shot at me. I take proper precautions, and I'm not, and I do what the security advises me to do, and I don't do anything reckless. So I understand the issue, and I understand the risk, but it's not something that I worry about.
Have you read the book by New York Sun columnist Ira Stoll called JFK Conservative? And if yes, what's your view? I mean, where would you think your uncle would be politically today, and for that matter, your father?
Well, I don't think that they would have a place in today's Democratic Party. I think that the Democratic Party that I grew up with was the party of peace. My father ran against the Vietnam War. My uncle refused to get into a war despite enormous pressure that he did so. He felt that. He said he wanted on his gravestone. He kept the peace, and he thought that was the primary job of a president. We were always the anti-war party. We were the party of civil rights and constitutional rights, including freedom of speech. Today, we're the party of censorship and surveillance, and we're the party of war. And the interesting thing is today, 750 military and intelligence leaders endorsed Kamala Harris, and we saw before that, we saw John Bolton and Dick Cheney endorse her. Kamala Harris's speech at the Democratic Convention was a very belligerent speech that appears to have been written by the neocons. It was all about U.S. global hegemony and, us being the policemen of the world. When Dick Cheney was anathema to the Democratic Party that I grew up with. He was the author or the perpetrator of the Patriot Act. Him and John Bolton. This was the beginning of the surveillance state, this national security state. He broke with 200 years of American tradition by implementing torture, extraordinary renditions. He got us into the war in Iraq on a pretense, a lie, as the worst foreign policy calamity in our history. And Dick Cheney's endorsement of Kamala Harris should be a message to every Democrat, because Dick Cheney still believes the Iraq War was a good idea. He believes the Patriot Act was a good idea. He has not changed. The Democratic Party has changed. The Democratic Party I grew up with was the party of the poor, of firefighters, of cops, of working people, of labor. Instead, there's been an inversion. You saw Sean O'Brien, the Teamster leader, the very dynamic, charismatic leader, speaking at the Republican convention and refusing 2 weeks ago to endorse a Democratic candidate. This is unprecedented.
Yeah.
And if you look at just to illustrate the completeness of this inversion, The Democrats have become the party of big tech, big pharma, big food, big agriculture, Wall Street banks, and the military-industrial complex. And 4 years ago, in 2020, roughly 50% of the people in this country voted Democrat and 50% Republican. The 50% who voted Democrat own 70% of the wealth in this country, and the 50% who voted Republican own 30%. So that was exact inversion of what it was when my uncle was president. And the Republicans this year, the Democrats this year, have outraised the Republicans 3-1. Oh, Kamala Harris has 3 times what Donald Trump has raised because, as Charlie Kirk said to me, Donald Trump drove the billionaires out of the Democratic Party. Oh, and then, you know, my uncle Ted Kennedy wrote Title IX, which gave women the right to practice sports with the same resources, was something very important to him. The Democratic Party are now against women's sports. Right. And all of these different issues, you know, there's been a complete inversion of the two parties, and that's one of the reasons I left the party, because it no longer represents the kind of things that I right. And if you went down a checklist of all the policies that my uncle and father believed, and I believe I would check every one of those boxes. And right. And Donald Trump today is much closer to that, and he doesn't agree with me on everything. The great thing about Donald Trump is when he proposed unity, he said, I don't care if you agree with me on everything. We can differ on issues, but the issues that I'm most concerned with that you are the economy, which means restoring the middle class, restoring our industrial base, the border, which is existential also for our country, the Make America Healthy Again, surveillance and censorship, and ending the wars. And those I agree 100% with him on. And
right. So I do just want to say that we want to try and save some time for audience questions. So to be efficient, we should circulate some cards around the audience, and then you bring them up to the front. I'll try and get a few of them in before we let our guests go. You know, your family and persona sort of have extended beyond just sort of boring political into the realm of celebrity. Obviously, your wife is a cultural celebrity, but also, you know, your kids hang out in a lot of those circles, and I believe in particular one of your sons used to date Taylor Swift, and she was also friends with one of your daughters. So I'm assuming that you've had some personal interactions. Obviously, she's quite a big figure in American public life today. I mean, what do you make of her endorsement of Kamala Harris, or do you think it's a non-issue?
Listen, I don't. First of all, Taylor Swift, in my encounters with her, was an incredibly classy human being. And I would not say this about every celebrity, but I think she has a lot of good sense and a lot of wisdom. And she's a very good person in all of my interactions with her. And so I have nothing bad to say about her. What I think is that we ought to all be able to disagree about things and our politics and still get along with each other. And unfortunately, for the Democratic Party, like, I have lots of friends who are Democrats, and I don't dislike them, I don't hate them, I don't disrespect them, I think they're wrong. And that's all, but it doesn't make me hate people, it doesn't make me consider them deplorable. It doesn't make me think that they're, you know, trying to destroy the republic. I think, unfortunately, a lot of Democrats, because of the choices I've made, do consider me deplorable, and have, you know, made efforts to demonize and marginalize me. And I don't resent that, and I don't, and I'm not, you know, saying that out of any sense of aggrievement or persecution. I think it's a bad phenomena for our country, because I think we, you know, if we don't learn to get along with each other, this country's going to be destroyed. And what I said during my endorsement of President Trump is I said, we need to learn to love our kids more than we hate each other. And that's the only way that we're going to save them.
Now, if you'll indulge me, there's a game I'd like to play. There have been a remarkable number of wild and wonderful stories that have been written about you, claims. So the game is called True or False. I'm going to try and get through as many of them as possible and tell me if they're right or wrong.
I'm not going to comment on it. And let me tell you why. Because if I do that, then the only thing that the media will cover about this is what I say here. And it's a distraction. You know, those things are, that if you look at ABC, NBC, CBS, the New York Times, those are the only things that they ever write about me, is gossipy stuff and, you know, my colorful life. So,
you see that all as a negative?
And what I've said, it's a negative if that's all they talk about.
Maybe like the whale caucus and all of that stuff.
Whatever. If they, you know, you can't help yourself, I understand. You need to do that. But you know, I want to talk about the fact that our children are the unhealthiest kids in the world. I want to talk about the fact that we're in a war of choice that is bringing us to the brink of nuclear destruction, nuclear exchange. If we do have a nuclear war, a recent Pentagon report said it will last 73 minutes. World War III will last 73 minutes, a full-range nuclear exchange, and that 5 billion people will die around the world. That's what we should be talking about, not bears, not whales, not any of this stuff. We should be talking about the growth, the emergence of censorship and surveillance around the world. So I'm not interested in playing those kind of games with you. So maybe in private I'll do it with you.
Well, you know, I do feel like in this country, and in some countries it's not like that. And I get your point about the focus, right? I mean, we're having an hour-long discussion. Most of it's on the substance. But the American people want to get a full picture of who their leaders are. And the truth is, it's different in France, for example. There's a lot of sort of sordid stuff that goes on, and nobody cares and nobody even talks about it. But it does seem like in America, there is a lot of interest, a lot of discussion about every single aspect of our leaders' lives. So is your view that, you know, it shouldn't be that way and that, you know, we shouldn't talk about...
I don't think that. I think there's human curiosity about people, and that those stories, you know, and even all the stories about me are valuable if they're asked in a way and covered in a way that is fair, that is accurate, that is, you know, not... that adds to the discussion and adds to the, you know, that fleshes out the profile of a human personality or character. The problem is that's not what happened. What's happened is the press has an imbalance, and the imbalance is that with the mainstream media, that's the only thing, literally, the only thing they will talk about. And so I'm not, you know, I'm no longer indulging that. I came into this election saying, the first day I said I had told my wife, I have so many skeletons in my closet that if they could vote, I could be king of the world. But I, you know, I'm happy to talk about them, and I've been very forthright and honest about my addiction, my 14-year heroin addiction and recovery. And all of these issues are out there because I've been willing to talk about them and answer questions, a broad range of questions about things that other people may consider embarrassing or want to hide. And I don't want to do that. I want people to, you know, I am who I am, and I'm not embarrassed about it. And and that's who I am, and that's the kind of life that I've led. Thank you. Unfortunately, you know, we've reached a point where I've been answering those questions for 18 months, and that I said 90% of the questions that I've answered have been on those subjects, and the imbalance is so wrong that I'm just not going to do it anymore.
Right. So, you know, on the story about this relationship with a reporter, which is in the
And
press.
I'm not, you know, I'm not going to, I'm just not going to comment on those. I don't comment on those stories, and, you know, you seem very persistent.
Right. But you don't see it as different because it's a reporter, because that seems
like
more
I said,
substantive.
Like I said, I'm not going to comment on it.
Okay, so let's move to another subject. You are very popular among suburban housewives, which has been, you know, it's been a demographic that's been very hard for Republicans to reach. Do you feel that throwing your support behind Trump will help Republicans with this demographic?
I hope so.
Do we have any questions that we want to? Okay. While they come up, some question about where you live and where you're based. I know it was very important for you to be on the ballot in New York, in particular. Is that related? I mean, do you see New York as your home, or was there another part as to sort of why that was so central for you?
Yeah, this became an issue, and you know, because the Democrats sued me and 9 times in different states to try to get me off the ballot. I had 1 million Americans signing petitions, something everybody said I could not get on the ballot in every state, and yet I did. And I did that by doing something unprecedented that nobody in history had ever done before, which is to get 1 million signatures from Americans who wanted me on the ballot so they had the ability to vote. The Democrats tried to challenge those signatures, and they couldn't, because we got 3 times the number of signatures typically that we were required to get in all these different state contests. So they started suing me on other things, and they were suing, as President Trump saw, and when you get in front of a Democratic court in New York, that if you're on the wrong side of their partisan divide, that you're going to lose the case no matter what the law says. So I registered when it came time for me to be an independent. When you write these petitions, you have to tell in many states what your state of residence is. I said to my attorney, I have a resident, which is the primary residence where I live today in California. I have a residence that I've had for decades in New York, in Massachusetts, and I have a residence in New York. And my residence in New York is the only place I've ever voted. When I moved with Cheryl to California, I did not want to be a California resident. I wanted to remain. I've lived in New York since I was 10 years old. I've been a resident. I've been voting in New York since I was 18 years old. I have my driver's license in New York. My car's registered in New York. My law office is in New York. My law license is in New York. I pay taxes in New York. And my hunting license is in New York. My fishing license is in New York. My falconry license is in New York. I keep all my birds in New York, about 100 birds, hunting birds. And I consider. So I asked my attorney, which state do I name? And my attorney said, you got to name New York, and here's why. There are a number of states like New Hampshire and like Maine and other states where the only state you have to sign an affidavit saying that the state you claim as a resident is the state in which you vote. So you have to do that consistently across 50 states. So he said, you have no choice but to name New York as the state of your residence. So that's what I did. The Democrats said, oh, he's committing fraud. He doesn't really live in New York. He's living in California, which was true, which I said to the courts.
Right.
But if I had said anything else, they would have sued me in those states, and they would have won.
Right.
So, So
I know we're coming up on time here, but I want to try and do a fire round from the audience so we can get in as many as possible.
Sure.
And you know, you could see from the audience questions that they're really focused on the substance. So you'll appreciate that. If we can do, you know, short, sharp answers, 10, 15 seconds, we'll get through as many as we can.
I can't guarantee it.
If Trump loses, what happens to your Maha movement?
Oh, I'm expecting him to win.
Okay. Do you have a backup plan?
No, I don't have a plan B.
Got it. All right. Do you like golden retrievers?
Yeah, I mean, I like all dogs. I have a preference for bird dogs, for hunting dogs, and those are the dogs that I have. I have Gordon setters, and that's what a dog that I use for. I train hawks, and I hunt with them. So they go catch game. They catch rabbits, squirrels, pheasant, turkey. This is a sport that I learned when I was 9 years old, and I've been, you know, I wrote a lot of the laws governing falconry. I was president of the New York State Falconers Association. I wrote the exam that people take to become a falconer in this country, and I wrote the manual for how to pass that exam. So it's been kind of a preoccupation with me. Some would call it an obsession since I was little. And the dog that I prefer, that for me has worked out best, because the dogs hunt with the birds alongside them, and those are Gordon setters, and they're beautiful dogs, and that's what those are my preference. I also, a lot of falconers use dachshunds, and so I've had a lot of dachshunds as well, and I love them too.
By the way, I mean, you know, this sort of outdoorsmanship, you know, I think you could make the case that it's part of your charm, right?
Thank you.
Right.
I'm happy to talk about that all day.
Right. Well, what it means is some of those wild stories, you know, might fall in line with that sort of view.
Well, I mean, yeah.
But I get your view on the focus. Okay. Let's talk about this. Got to ask it. How do we keep the mainstream media honest?
Yeah, I mean, it's very disturbing what's happened with the mainstream media, and part of it is that it's a declining industry, and so a lot of them are leveraging the credibility that they built up over years and years for different agendas. And the principal agenda of those companies is advertising revenues, and unfortunately, the biggest advertisers are pharmaceutical companies. About 70% of evening news ads come from pharma, and so those pharmaceutical companies are advertising on those networks not only to push out their products, but also to control the content of the news. And that's why you see this, part of the reason you see this tremendous hostility toward me, and then the food companies as well. I think it is, if I were President of the United States, I would end pharmaceutical advertising on television.
So
there's only 2 countries in the world that allow direct-to-consumer pharmaceutical advertising on television or radio, and one is the United States, the other is New Zealand, and we have the worst health, and we pay more for our health care in any country in the world, and we have the worst health of any country in the world. And part of that is because the control that pharmaceutical companies have over control of the media.
So I mean, it's interesting that you make this point, because, you know, the media industry, certainly the news industry, is becoming more bifurcated between those that are reliant on advertising revenue and those that are more subscription-based. So would your view be that a more honest media is a media that has less advertising and more subscribers, namely?
I mean, I would say that those are ancillaries to each other. That clearly, if you're not dependent on advertising revenue, you have more opportunity to explore existential truths.
What is your view on fluoridated water?
I think fluoride is a poison. my son was saying this. My son was in the hazardous waste industry, and he had taken an exam, and that if a fluoride truck crashes on the highway, they have to clear the highway for miles around, and people come in Tyvek suits and respirators and gloves to do the cleanup. And you know, it's a toxic ingredient. It's a toxic byproduct of certain chemical process and oil industry process. And for many years, those industries, it was costing them thousands of dollars per drum to get rid of them. And then they came up with the idea, why don't we put it in the water supply? And they did that, and it causes cancers. Of course, it causes your bones to deteriorate, and it causes severe IQ loss. And last week, a group that I'm associated with won a 7-year lawsuit against EPA on fluoride that I think will result in the fluoride being removed from all the water supplies in this country. Oh, the simple answer is I don't like it.
How do you view the climate agenda?
Well,
15 seconds.
Yeah, I believe climate is a real issue that's existential, but I don't insist other people believe that. And I think that climate, particularly in the hands of this White House, has been used to, as a crisis, as all crises are, to promote another agenda, which is the imposition of totalitarian controls and the shift in wealth upward to large companies. You know, the people who are benefiting from President Biden's Inflation Reduction Act, which is his signature climate regulation, are Goldman Sachs, BlackRock, Wells Fargo, JP Morgan, and a lot of foreign offshore wind companies. Offshore wind, I'm a big supporter of onshore wind. Offshore wind is terrible, and it's destroying. In the last 2 years, prior to 2016, we were getting on average about 1.9 whale deaths a year on the East Coast. The last 2 years, it's been 109. So we're getting 5.9 a month, and it is now the right whale. There's only 360 right whales left. These whales, the sei whales, sperm whales, minke whales, are all being just destroyed, wiped out. And clearly it's because of these wind farms. They'll say, well, we don't have that science. Why is that? Because NIMS and NOAA refuse to do the science, but everybody knows what's happening. And then in the Midwest, we're getting thousands of miles of pipelines to build these carbon capture facilities and using warming as a pretense. But actually, it's just a gift to the methane industry, to Monsanto, to BlackRock, to Smithfield, and to the oil industry, which is using the methane to pump the last drops of oil out of the well. So it's actually going to add to climate problems, and it does nothing for them. It's a giant boondoggle. And I think what we should be focusing on is restoring our soils. If we restore our soils, ending the use of glyphosate and pesticides, these pesticides destroy all the biomicrobe in those soils, and that biomicrobe has an extraordinary capacity to absorb carbon and then to grow crops. And if we restored all of our soils in this country, we would push the carbon in the atmosphere back to pre-industrial levels. And that's what we should be focusing on. It would give us better food. It would give us more independent small farmers in this country. It would bolster our democracy. It would make us all healthier. It would end the dead zone in the Gulf, which is destroying hundreds of thousands of tons of seafood every year. And that is the solution, and not these big mega these geoengineering projects. And then I believe also the other way to regulate energy is through free markets, by ending subsidies across the board to the energy industry and forcing the industry to actually internalize the costs of pollution. And that's the solution, not top-down controls.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr., thank you for joining the New York Sun.
Thank you very much.
Okay. And thanks to all of you for joining us tonight.